Our next genre that we wanted to talk about was sci-fi, and Jason's first on that with Starfinder.
Yes, Starfinder is a pretty popular takeoff on Pathfinder. It takes everything that Pathfinder has and adds space. And you have space wizards, and you have space elves, and space elementals. You have everything that's contained in Pathfinder, in addition to all these alien races, things like skitters, which are basically Stitch from Lilo and Stitch, and it's very, very open, but it's very popular as well, especially in the Cincinnati area. Both the Pathfinder Society and the Starfinder Society are very, very active. And it's one reason I listed it as sci-fi and fantasy, is because you can do all the fantasy races. You can have elves and dwarves that are just warriors and rogues and wizards, in addition to things like having space wizards that have glowing swords that fight other people in one-on-one combat, or engineers that get together and there's a very detailed system for starship combat. I've played a little bit of Starfinder, not too much, but because it is so popular, I did want to make sure it gets a mention under science fiction. The books are averagely expensive, and there are things that you will find in Starfinder that were then used in Pathfinder 2nd edition, from what I understand. And it's kind of an evolving system, and they have a decent number of supplements out for it. So like Pathfinder, you can basically build whatever you want and customize it to an extreme degree. That's a lot of what I have to say about Starfinder. Let me check and see if there are any questions. Next up is Star Wars in all its various incarnations. There have been about 4. So Amanda's going to talk to us about some of those and any of her favorites.
Yes. Well, I'm going to talk about one of them because I've only played one, which is the Fantasy Flight. I don't have to tell you what Star Wars is, luckily, but I will say that Fantasy Flight, I'm not sure about the other ones, but Fantasy Flight at least is very much based, like the system is similar to if you've ever played the video game Knights of the Old Republic, just the way the leveling and stats work in that. They're very, very similar. The dice are very interesting, and actually a lot of the players in my group were kind of put off by them at first. I will try to hold them up for you to see because they're all different symbols, and you kind of have to learn this whole new way of looking at your rolls and understanding what it says or what it means. And I sense a theme in some of my favorite games here, but what I love about how these roles work is it's very narrative. Like it's again not just like a yes or no, succeed or fail. Depending on what you roll, because there are positive and negative dice to every roll, and you could succeed at something, but roll enough negative things that there are horrible consequences that happened, even though you succeeded in whatever action you're trying to do. So it's like, all right, you successfully leapt across this entire thing, slashed your lightsaber, and knocked this guy out, but you also have pierced a hole in the hull, and now there is a problem because the vacuum of space is now an issue. So stuff like that, where you kind of take turns going back and forth with your GM, like, okay, well, you succeeded and you like rolled so well. Tell me what, or tell me how you're doing this or what you're doing. And the GM will be like, okay, but also here's what's happening on the negative side of things. Obviously, you have a huge range of options of characters and races, and like, you know, an extensive timeline if you want to go canon or not canon, or, you know, anything your imagination can handle, basically. Um, when we played, I actually did a force sensitive Gand, so that was a lot of fun. And there was just somehow I became the most charismatic of the party, being, you know, basically a giant bug with a respirator thing. And so there's a lot of just opportunity for cool story arcs and just interesting stuff. And I'm looking at the chat. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I was kind of responding for you.
Yep. Yes. So that's
And
kind of all I have to say on that. Yes, go ahead.
as I said in the chat, I also play the Fantasy Flight Star Wars, but my very first RPG that I ever played was the D20 Star Wars game, which was when Wizards of the Coast had the license. And it's really funny, but the D20 Star Wars, that was the Star Wars RPG game for many, many years. All of like the 2000s, I think, from like late 90s to what, like 20. Fantasy Flight only got the license when Disney bought Star Wars. So that's how recent that this game has come out. But the D20 version of Star Wars literally is D&D Star Wars. So it's Star Wars universe, it's Star Wars stories in space, but because it was by Wizards of the Coast, your character sheets look very similar, your combat looks very similar, it's still pretty combat heavy. But yeah, so the generation of Star Wars games before that was very much D&D Star Wars, but it's still a very beloved system. And there's lots of books and lots of things that you can do. And that's kind of my favorite system because it was my first.
That's awesome. If anyone else, any of the other hosts have experience with the other Star Wars systems and want to chime in at this point.
I have also played the FFG version a little bit. I've not GM'd it, but I've played it half a dozen times or so. It is very cinematic. It's not very crunchy. And the nice thing is you have the entire expanded universe to draw on. So if you're not into world building, if you find it a little overwhelming, but you've grown up with Star Wars, like I have, and you know everything that happened in Star Wars, all the expanded universe, what you read the Marvel comics, you followed the Dark Horse stuff, you played the video games, you can take all of that and mush it into your campaign. Now, my biggest experience with Star Wars is the first edition that came out, Star Wars D6 from West End Games. Very well supported, very cinematic, very simple system where you just pick up a handful of dice and total them, and they're all D6s. So you just take them and go groups of 10, and there's a lot of standard difficulties, like a very easy task is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, and on up. Combat is not very realistic with hit points. You just kind of get stunned and then wounded again, and then you die. It's not very forgiving, but it encourages you to do things like make funny noises as you're playing. So you got to make the droid noises, and you have to make the laser phaser sounds as you're playing. The other thing it does is it talks about scale. Never blow up a city when you can blow up a planet. There are never millions of people's lives at stake. There are always billions. Don't have a massive fleet battle of 1,000 ships. Have it be 100,000 ships going into conflict with one another over a planet. Star Wars D6, from what I understand, is publicly available. So you can, if you can find it, you can download everything that West End Games ever published for it. The other thing is there has been a fan version called Revised, Expanded, and Updated, and it's also known as Re-Up. And that takes everything from D6, codifies it, brings it together, and makes one consistent rule system for Star Wars D6 that you can then turn around and use. It includes Clone Wars, it includes A New Hope, it includes stuff from the comic books. Just everything is included in Star Wars D6, just like some of the other Star Wars genres. Anybody else have anything with Star Wars?
No, that was about it. I know that my group is massive Star Wars fans, which is why we always have at least one Star Wars game going for the last 10 years I've been with the group, but they've been together for 20 years, and they started off with the D6 system, and that was always one of their favorite systems, and half of their like epic stories of, oh my gosh, do you remember that one time? It was always the Star Wars D6 system. That's all I have. Just epicness.
I'm going to agree with what Whitney said.
All right, Jason, hey, it's your turn again.
Okay. One of the reasons I'm talking so often is because I have the broadest experience with a lot of these games. Some I have not played extensively. Some I have played extremely extensively for years and years, or have read lore for decades. Traveler is another old school Renaissance game. It is more or less the only science fiction game that was out there when the original edition of D&D came into being. There were some other ones like Gamma World and Metamorphosis Alpha that simulated like after the bomb sort of things. But if you really wanted to go into space, find aliens, explore planets, Traveler was your go-to system. And it's very, very free-form. There's not a lot of stats. There's not a lot of skills. I mean, your character sheet can fit on an index card. It is very, very simplified. It's also notorious for having a character creation system where you can die before the character is actually created, because you go through years and years of military service, and sometimes your military service ends when you die. There are automatic Traveler character generators out there available on the internet. I highly recommend them because it's nothing more frustrating than making up a cool character, having 16 years of skills and military service, and then you die. The other thing about Traveler is your characters start much older because they've generally served in the military and have applicable skills. So it's not uncommon to see characters in their mid-30s to mid-40s just starting out on their adventuring career. One of the other things about Traveler is the main mode it goes into is exploration, where you are going out and exploring new planets and finding new planets and encountering new worlds, new civilizations, new aliens, all of that. The other major factor is basically running your own business and maintaining your own ship. There's a lot of rules for that, and there's rules for spaceship combat and repairing your ship afterwards and everything else. Traveler is a very broad game, and you can explore it over and over again. And it does have a set setting in the Imperium, but you can take the Traveler system and apply it to any big sci-fi universe you want. So if you want to do universe creation on your own for world building, Traveler is an excellent system because it is so broad and doesn't have that many constraining rules and constraining things in their setting where you have to follow it. People have played Traveler for many years and still continue to play Traveler because it is a solid system. And that's one reason I wanted to make sure to mention it under the science fiction settings, is sometimes it can be a popular game that is played lots locally. one of the difficulties in all these different games is it's very easy to find Dungeons and Dragons games. It is more difficult to find Dungeon World or Dungeon Crawl Classics or Traveler games because they are kind of niche. But I want to let you know about them. That way, if perhaps in the future, you can maybe run your own after hearing about it, or maybe take a look into it and get a group together and say, here, DM, have this great, awesome book. Okay, your turn to run, and things like that. That's going to kind of do it for Traveler and the sci-fi settings.